on Q&A. But what is interesting for businesses and homeowners is that for insurance companies, for local government, the big focus for them is not so much on mitigation, while they recognise that's important. It's the adaptability, if you like, or the ability to cope with the existing impacts or the impacts of climate change that are coming regardless of whether we manage to cut emissions from here or not. And it is already having a huge impact and causing a lot of thinking about how New Zealand's going to cope with that. For where we live, how much we pay in insurance premiums, are there areas that are going to be no-go zones in future on coastal areas or even other parts of the country? Now, joining me to discuss that issue this week is the Insurance Council's CEO, Tim Grafton. He has talked quite a bit about this issue in the last few months and years. It is great to have you along, Tim. Thank you very much for joining us.
Kia ora, Corin. Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. Now, let's just run us through your main concerns. So I'm assuming you're not too worried about the government focusing on cutting emissions and that type of thing. But your worry is that we're already seeing the impacts and that those impacts are cumulative, and that we should be that the government needs to help in terms of getting us to adapt to the effects of climate change.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. So cumulative effects of climate change means that even if we magicked zero emissions overnight, which is impossible, we've still got sea level rise. Sea level rise in coastal areas brings properties at risk. We already know that there are about 40,000 houses within 1.5 metres of the mean high tide level in New Zealand today. So that means with a 30 centimetre rise in a sea level, we will see those properties experiencing king tide, storm surge events that are 1 in 100 year events today occurring every couple of years, or with a 40 centimetre rise in some parts of the country.
So how quickly are we expecting
monthly.
that sort of a rise to happen, and so how quickly is it going to affect homeowners?
Well, you can take some comfort, but only limited comfort, I think, from looking at these are effects that might happen, say, in the next 40, 50 years. But the fact is that you can get extreme events today. So you can get a 1 in 100 year event tomorrow. Sure. If you had 100 of them in New Zealand, you could expect absolutely certainty that we would be getting one every year. So there are parts of New Zealand that are always going to get this risk that they face. So we've got to start reducing those risks, which are just going to mount over the years.
This is interesting. So I'm quite interested in this idea of what some people are calling is it insurance retreat? This idea that in fact the efforts to combat climate change will be led by the insurance industry, because the insurance industry will stop insuring some houses that are deemed to be too risky. Therefore, people might continue to want to live by the beach in a coastal area that's deemed at risk, but if they can't get insurance, then that's what will drive people away from those coastal areas. Is that what's going to happen?
So insurance signals will be incremental, so there will be increases in premium over time, there will be increases in excess, that's the amount that the insured has to pay up front. And we had a great example in Christchurch where with the earthquakes, the water level table rose relative to the land, and we had frequent flooding in an area called Flockton Basin. That resulted in excesses going up to $10,000 for every flood event. The City Council moved in, spent tens of millions to mitigate or really to adapt to that situation, and as a result the premiums have come down, so the transfer of risk remains affordable and available to people. But critically, the point that you're making is that if insurers were to retreat and say we're not providing that cover, and if banks, importantly, providing those 25, 30-year loans were to think ahead and say, hey, actually, if insurance isn't going to be there in 25, 30 years' time, then the term of my loan is going to be maybe 10, 15 years. If the term of the loan is 10 or 15 years, it's going to be more expensive. That's going to have an effect on the number of people who could afford to be there, even if they wanted to be there, given they wouldn't be able to get insurance or a bank loan beyond that time. And that will have a downward spiral effect on property prices, and it has happened elsewhere in the world.
Are we seeing it here already? Are there areas where we're starting to see that?
I think there are pockets of New Zealand where insurance appetite for risk is getting extremely limited. There are pockets in the Hawke's Bay. There are significant issues in areas Hasn't happened yet, but the likes of the Dunedin City Council's looking at South Dunedin, where there are 3,000 or 4,000 homes that face significant challenges over the years ahead. But, if you look at the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment's report of a couple of years ago, there are areas in Wellington, there are areas in Christchurch, there are areas in Auckland, there are areas in Northland. We've had this year already properties in Westport and in Kaiawa in Thames where houses are built below sea level in Kaiawa, and those properties face major challenges in the years ahead.
Should they be allowed to be built?
Well, I think there's two issues here, and climate change adaptation's challenging, so we should not be consenting for future developments in areas that make absolutely no sense at all. So you can deal with that situation in a very straightforward way by making the right decisions now. But I think the other side of the coin is we do have people who've bought properties by the sea, who've lived there for many years, and you've got the challenge there of the intergenerational and intra-generational equity issues. So should people living in hills be supporting the payments for people in the flood-prone areas, or should the people of this generation be paying for the benefit for the future generation? And those are complicated issues, and councils really need to be taking their communities with them so they own the problem and are part of that solution.
But the homeowners and the assets are primarily in the hands of older New Zealanders. Presumably they're not going to be as willing to share that risk, are they?
Well, I'm not sure there's necessarily older New Zealanders. I think a lot of wealthier New Zealanders have purchased properties very close to the sea because, that's kind of classic Kiwi dream that you live as close.
But are they being subsidised in a sense that everyone else pays slightly higher premium in order to allow a greater risk for those homeowners?
Again, if you're talking about the insurance market, it's a competitive market. So to some degree, people will be providing not the absolute risk rating of premium that should necessarily apply if you were doing it on a purely risk-based basis. So, here in Petone in Wellington, a modest house there, if you were risk rating that, could be facing $7,000 or $8,000 in premium a year because it faces liquefaction, flood, earthquake,
the whole shebang.
The whole shebang.
Yeah.
But they don't get that because it's a competitive market, and the first one that went in.
So that's up to individual insurance companies to make
their
that decision.
appetite for risk and their pricing of that risk, of those decisions will be made. But there will be a point where the risk gets too high for anybody to entertain unless something is done about how we manage that. And in managing that situation for incumbent properties, we've got to look at adaptive pathways, so we don't necessarily have to look at, let's retreat completely because this is going to be a disaster area in 40 years' time. We can look at, what can we do now to minimise those risks? Is it dune protection or something of that order? Or is it constructing some infrastructure to provide protection for the short to medium term? Do we then need to be looking at how we can make those houses more relocatable? Do we as a council need to be looking at what land we might have surplus to manage that?
But you want some government leadership on this as well. So
all
this effort's going into a climate change commission and areas of, and obviously this drive to cut emissions, but you want some government action or leadership on this issue.
So we're one of the few countries in the OECD that doesn't have a national strategy to deal with adaptation as a result of climate change. So we need to get that one underway. We need to have that long view at central government level. We need to have a view of what is the risk that this country faces from climate change and how we prioritise that. We need to be looking at legislation that aligns, whether that's the RMA, the Building Act and local government legislation, so that the framework is there for the long term and on a bipartisan basis.
This is a strange question, but I'm not that familiar with insurance premiums in the fine print. But is climate change actually worded and written into premiums yet?
Climate change per se, no. But
will it be soon?
Oh, look, it's the effect of climate change. So if it's flood, elsewhere in the world, in many countries, flood is an additional optional risk that you take out for your house. In New Zealand, we benefit from all-risk policies largely. So you buy your house insurance, it covers you for earthquake, flood, etc. So the question is will the day come where insurers will be saying in some parts, well, actually, if you want flood, then that's something that you'll have to pay something additional for because you're in a higher risk area. So it's the effects of climate change rather than climate change per se, because you need to have some clarity of definition.
But do you think we could see a written into premiums, I mean, where it says, the effects of climate change, that terminology?
I think it would need to be more precise than that because the effects of climate change are vast and numerous. So, it's acidification of the oceans, it's the effects on...
Be an interesting point though, won't it? Because if that does happen, that's quite, once insurance companies, once that sector decides, then that's a business-led decision, and that's probably a pretty bit of a line in the sand, so to speak.
Yeah, but insurance policies are about specifically identifying and defining the risk, and therefore climate change itself is far too broad a term to be able to just plonk into a policy. So I think it needs to be quite specific to flood, wind damage, or whatever.
Just before we move on, what's your advice to Kiwis, young Kiwis maybe buying houses in areas, and when they're thinking about insurance, they're thinking about climate change, they're thinking about these issues, what would you advise them to be thinking about and doing?
Well, I think the same advice to anybody purchasing a house. Have a look at the Land Information Memorandum. Have a look at what the council has identified as hazards. So there are councils around the country, like in Nelson, for instance, where you can go on to the Nelson City Council site and look at what their projections are for flood 50 and 100 years out. Now, no one's going to live to 100 years if they're purchasing it. Well, they may be. But have a look at where you're going to be locating that house. And I think, and what we've seen in other countries, unfortunately, is those at the low income end are the ones that tend to end up in the cheaper properties, which are the properties that end up being the ones most at risk. And the last thing we want is people on low incomes in high risk areas, because that becomes a political economy issue for the government.
Lots to think about there. As a couple of issues floating around with insurance.